Hello and welcome to this overview of the Ross-Garrett model for moral decision making. I'm James Sennett. I'm professor of business ethics in the School of Business at Brunel University. This model is based on the moral theory of 20th century British philosopher W.D. Ross and important revisions and additions by contemporary American philosopher Jan Garrett, hence the moniker the Ross-Garrett model for moral decision making. Ross, like Immanuel Kant and other moral theorists, believes that the key notion in morality is duty. Hence, Ross is what philosophical ethics calls a deontologist. However, unlike Kant, Ross does not consider moral decision-making to be a matter of logic. Rather, Ross argues that moral duties are grounded in what he called moral intuition. However, it's important not to misunderstand this term. Ross does not mean by intuition simply whatever pops into our heads or what we feel or desire. Rather, Ross means by moral intuition a moral idea that is so clear and obvious to us that we actually consider it impossible that we could be wrong. A simple moral claim: it's wrong to take something that doesn't belong to you without permission, or more succinctly, it's wrong to steal. Ross argues that this simple claim is obviously true. So obvious, in fact, that virtually no one would argue with us about it. If someone did argue with us, we would think that she was being facetious or obnoxious or just trying to kid with us. If we did become convinced that she was serious, we would think the person was mentally or emotionally disturbed in some way. The one thing we would never consider is that the claim it's wrong to steal is controversial in any way. It's as obvious to us that it's wrong to steal as it is that the average human being has 2 arms and 2 legs. Ross argues that this level of intuitive clarity is all that's required to justify our beliefs in such moral claims. If we are rational in believing that people have 2 arms and 2 legs, we are rational in believing that it's wrong to steal. Ross identifies 7 such intuitively obvious moral duties. What he calls fidelity: speak and behave honestly and properly represent yourself to the world. This duty obviously includes telling the truth and not lying. It also includes keeping promises and not acting in deceitful ways. Second, what Ross called reparation: make up for any loss, damage, or harm you have caused. Third, gratitude: be grateful for good done for you and repay it by doing good for others. Fourth, justice: distribute the benefits and burdens of community fairly. Fifth, beneficence: do good, act to benefit others. Sixth, harm prevention: do not allow harm to come to anyone. It's important to note that this duty actually has 2 sides: a passive side, don't do anything that would cause harm, and an active side, do what you can to prevent harm from occurring. Finally, there was what Ross called self-improvement. Practice beneficence and harm prevention toward yourself. Take care of yourself and work to better yourself. Garrett adds 3 duties to Ross's list, all 3 of which he believes, and I agree, Ross would sanction. First, respect for rights. Respect and protect the rights of others. Second, special care. Show the special care due to those with whom you have close relationships. Family, friends, etc. have a right to a greater proportion of our attention than other people. And third, non-parasitism. Do not be a leech on society or your family. Pull your own weight. Do what you can to contribute. Now, there are 3 more additions that I make to the model, grounded in standard moral theory and, I believe, a good dose of Ross's moral intuition. First, utility maximizing. Act to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This duty is taken from the moral theory of utilitarianism, perhaps the most popular moral theory in the Western world today. Next, universalizability. Act in ways you would want others to act in the same situations. This is an ugly word, but a useful moral concept that we get from Kant. The idea is that we should do something only if it's rational to say everyone should act this way. That is, if it wouldn't be okay for everybody to act this way, then you shouldn't act this way. This rule is grounded in the idea that morality is no respecter of persons. What's moral for one person is moral for all. And then finally, the golden rule. Treat others the way you believe you ought to be treated. This is one of the that most of us have heard since we were kids. It's a staple of virtually every major religious tradition in the world and has always been recognized as a good shortcut rule for figuring out the right thing to do. So we have a total of 13 duties. These 13 will serve as the foundation of our Ross-Garrett model for moral decision making. Now, when I was a kid, we used to refer to any collection of 13 things as a baker's dozen. Stemmed from an old tradition of your friendly neighborhood baker putting together a dozen donuts or rolls or buns and then throwing in an extra one as a thank you for being a good customer. Well, I'm going to show my age and refer to this collection of 13 duties as the baker's dozen. Anytime I say the baker's dozen, I'm referring to these 13 duties that we've identified, which are the basis of the Ross-Garrett model. Now, it's very important to bear in mind that Ross did not consider his list of duties to be closed, and I do not consider the list of the baker's dozen to be closed. That is, this list is probably incomplete and could stand to be expanded, and this is precisely what the Ross-Garrett model is designed to do. Ross calls these basic moral duties prima facie duties. Prima facie, of course, is a Latin term that literally translates as first face or initial view. Perhaps the most accurate translation in most of the applications of this phrase is something like at first glance. Now, with regards to these basic duties of the Ross-Garrett model, I think the best way to interpret the prima facie label is that these are duties that apply all things being equal. A good way to think about this label is to say that these duties are to be followed in any given situation unless we have very good reason to believe that they should not be followed. In other words, the one who claims that a duty does not apply bears the burden of proof and showing that it doesn't apply. But what could possibly count as good reason to believe that a prima facie duty doesn't apply or should not be followed in a certain circumstance? Well, the most obvious reason why a given prima facie duty would not be followed in certain circumstances is that it conflicts with another prima facie duty that also applies in those circumstances. For example, there is the age-old moral conundrum, is it wrong to lie in order to save someone's life? Here we have the duties of fidelity and harm prevention in conflict. Fidelity says we should tell the truth. Harm prevention says we should do what we can to prevent harm. If we obey fidelity, we violate harm prevention and vice versa. Such dilemmas show that it is not possible to follow all of these duties every time they're applicable. When duties conflict like this, we cannot follow one without violating the other. So what are we to do? Well, one solution Ross says we do not have. There is no hierarchy of duties showing which are more important than which. In other words, the baker's dozen cannot be simply ranked 1 to 13 in importance, so all we have to do in a conflict is just check to see which duty is higher up on the list. For any two prima facie duties, it's possible for the first to be more important than the second in some circumstances, and for the second to be more important than the first in other circumstances. So how do we tell which is which? How can we solve the dilemma of conflicting prima facie duties? Well, this requires a process that Ross calls deliberation. We must consider a number of relevant issues in order to figure out how to weigh the conflicting duties against each other. Eventually, Ross believes, our deliberation will bring us to a conclusion that one of the conflicting duties is the overriding duty that must be followed in this situation. This overriding duty Ross calls our actual duty. Now, in developing this model, I've compiled a list of what I call deliberative conditions. These are the particular kinds of issues that tend to be relevant when prima facie duties conflict. A good way to think of these conditions is in terms of the answers to the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. So, for example, answers to the who question would tell us the status and relationships of the people most prominently involved in or affected by the decision to be made. Also, answers to the what question would tell us the facts of the situation that are directly relevant to the decision to be made. Now, one very important revision that Garrett makes to Ross's theory is the addition of what he calls priority rules. These are rules of thumb to help in judging certain common prima facie duty conflicts. Garrett cites 3 such rules. The priority of harm prevention. All things being equal, harm prevention overrides other conflicting duties. Or as it was stated in the Hippocratic Oath, above all, do no harm. Second, Garrett names the priority of fidelity. All things being equal, fidelity takes priority over beneficence. It's more important to tell the truth, to be honest, than it is to be kind. And third, the priority of long-term benefit over short-term pleasure or pain. All things being equal, long-term benefits override any short-term pleasure or pain that may result from alternative actions. Priority rules, just like the duties themselves, are prima facie. They themselves may be overridden in certain circumstances. However, like prima facie duties, priority rules are to be followed unless there's very good reason to believe they should not be followed. Any applicable priority rule should be considered as the first step in the deliberation phase of the Ross-Garrett model. So here is the basic outline of the Ross-Garrett model: prima facie duties, deliberation, actual duties. We should first of all identify the prima facie duties that apply to the situation under consideration. Second, deliberate over any conflicts that arise among those duties, utilizing applicable deliberation conditions or priority rules. And finally, from the deliberation, determine what our actual duty is in this situation. Now, I developed the Ross-Garrett model as a decision-making procedure for my business ethics students. Consequently, I sought ways to develop and specialize the model for the particular kinds of decisions that people typically face in the business world. To this end, I developed a list of what I call business-specific prima facie duties, which are added to the baker's dozen in a business application of the Ross-Garrett model. So, for example, I introduced the business-specific prima facie duty of profitability. Conduct business in such a way as to maximize shareholder wealth in the long run. Another one I came up with is due care. Take every precaution to ensure the safety of consumers who use products and services and protect them from all foreseeable danger. And a third example, persuasion without manipulation. Employ only those marketing strategies and tactics that will not manipulate consumers or bypass informed consent in purchasing. I have 16 such business-specific prima facie duties, which I introduce to students as the class progresses, and we cover the specific types of business ethics issues to which they most readily apply. For example, I introduce persuasion without manipulation in the unit on ethics in marketing. The prima facie duty of profitability is an especially interesting one for the study of business ethics. Many people would balk at the idea of profitability being a moral duty. However, businesses typically take money from investors on the understanding, that is, with the promise, that the business will use that money in the most effective way possible to maximize the wealth of the investors. Therefore, profitability is a matter of promise keeping, a matter of fidelity. But this duty is only properly understood when we remember one of the cardinal rules of the Ross-Garrett model. There is no hierarchy of prima facie duties. Any duty can override or be overridden by any other duty in different circumstances. So, like any other prima facie duty, profitability does not always win, but it doesn't always lose either. Now, the moral duty of profitability is so central to the whole concept of business ethics that I define a business ethics problem specifically as a conflict between the prima facie duty of profitability and some other prima facie duty or set of prima facie duties a business might have. In other words, all business ethics problems can be analyzed in terms of the conflict between profitability and some other prima facie duty. This analytical viewpoint is what I call in my classes the business ethics perspective. It plays a large role in the development of the class. But again, duties are not the only prima facie element of the Ross-Garrett model. As the class goes on, we also compile a list of business-specific priority rules and a list of business-specific deliberative conditions. For example, business-specific priority rules include the priority of employee vulnerability. All things being equal, protection of the vulnerability of employees to the abuse of employer power takes precedence over the protection of the vulnerability of employers to the abuse of employee power. Yes, there is such a thing as employee power. Come take my class and I'll tell you about it. I also introduce the priority of job qualification and performance. All things being equal, an employer's qualifications for and performance at the position she holds takes precedence in evaluation over any other issues pertaining to decisions regarding workplace access. Business-specific deliberative conditions include stakeholder identification. Stakeholders with interests at stake in a decision should be identified as clearly as possible. There's also stakeholder interest identification. The interests of the stakeholders that are at stake in a decision should be identified as clearly as possible. And business interests and employee interests, often these interests conflict, and the interests of each must be carefully identified and weighed against one another to determine which might take priority in the situation. So the first couple of weeks of my business ethics class, I do the following. First, I introduce my students to Ross's basic moral theory. I then systematize Ross's theory into the Ross-Garrett model, complete with the baker's dozen deliberative priority rules and deliberative conditions. Finally, I introduce the concepts of business-specific prima facie duties, priority rules, and deliberation conditions, together with the first one or two entries in each of the lists. We then spend the rest of the class adding business-specific entries to each of these lists as our discussion of business ethics problems in various areas give rise to them. All the case analyses, many of the discussion questions, and quiz or exam questions in the class require students to analyze and decide business ethics dilemmas by walking explicitly through the steps of the Ross-Garrett model. They identify conflicting prima facie duties, then any applicable priority rules. They deliberate over the conflict, employing any applicable deliberative conditions, and finally they determine and argue for a given prima facie duty as the overriding and actual duty to be followed. This gives a great unity and continuity to the course's content and assessment instruments, and also gives the students lots of practice in applying the model. Well, that's it. Thanks for your attention. Please let me know any questions, comments, or criticisms that you might have. Thank you very much.